I don't care about your feelings. I have to go.
Why are you doing this to me? Don't leave. I don't understand. I have to go. They're gone. All the pictures. Why? I have to go. No. Wait. Please don't do this. Oh my God. What do we do? They found us. I'm scared. They're all out there. Why are they here?
When my own son looked me in the eyes and said, "You're sleeping somewhere else tonight," I laughed because I thought he was teasing me. Then I saw my suitcase sitting neatly beside the front door, my family photographs missing from the hallway walls, and my spare house keys placed on top of my luggage like they no longer belonged to me. Before I could even ask where I was supposed to go, every floodlight outside suddenly blazed to life. I turned toward the front window and froze. Dozens of people were standing silently in my front yard, watching my home as if they had been waiting for this exact moment. If you've ever had someone you trusted make you feel like a stranger in your own home, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. And if this journey touches your heart, please consider liking and subscribing so we can share more stories about family resilience and second chances together. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. People often ask me when I first realized my son had changed. The truth is, I can't point to a single day. Hearts rarely break all at once. They crack quietly, almost politely, until one morning you wake up surrounded by pieces you never noticed falling. Before Ethan looked me in the eye and told me I had no place left in my own home, there was another version of our family. One that still lives in my memories as clearly as the scent of fresh-cut grass after a summer rain. My name is Chloe Murray. I'm 67 years old, a retired elementary school teacher from a quiet suburb outside Columbus, Ohio. For 38 years, I was married to the love of my life, Thomas Murray. Thomas wasn't a man who filled rooms with loud laughter or grand speeches. He believed love was measured in smaller things, fixing a loose cabinet door before I noticed it, leaving my favorite coffee mug warming beside the kettle every morning, holding my hand whenever we walked through a parking lot, even after our hair had both turned gray. Together we built our house one paycheck at a time. When people drove past our neighborhood, they probably saw another ordinary brick home with white shutters and maple trees in the yard. I never saw an ordinary house. I saw the porch where Ethan took his first steps, while Thomas crouched a few feet away with his arms open. I saw the kitchen where birthday cakes leaned slightly to one side, because I was never very good at decorating them. I saw pencil marks inside the hallway closet, recording Ethan's height every birthday until he was taller than both of us. Every room carried a memory. Thomas used to joke that if someone ever tore down the house, they'd probably find our laughter trapped inside the walls. Back then, I believed homes remembered the people who loved them. Maybe they still do. After Ethan graduated from Ohio State University, he found work as a financial consultant in Columbus. He married Lauren 3 years later. She was intelligent, beautiful, always perfectly dressed. She knew which wine to order, which fork belonged with which course, and somehow managed to make every conversation sound thoughtful. I remember thinking Ethan had married someone far more sophisticated than anyone in our family. Lauren was never openly rude to me. She simply had a talent for making people feel slightly out of place. At family dinners, she'd smile and say things like, "Things are done differently nowadays," or, "You wouldn't understand how complicated finances have become." Always smiling, always gentle, yet somehow I always felt a little smaller after hearing her speak. Thomas noticed. One evening after they had gone home, he wrapped his arm around my shoulders while we washed dishes together. "Don't let polished manners fool you," he quietly said. "Character isn't measured by confidence." I laughed and teased him for sounding suspicious. He simply smiled. I hope I'm wrong. I wish he had been. When Thomas died from pancreatic cancer 6 years ago, the silence inside the house became unbearable. For weeks, I found myself setting out 2 coffee cups every morning before realizing I no longer needed the second one. Grief has strange habits. Sometimes it lets you forget. Sometimes it forces you to remember. Ethan visited almost every day after the funeral. He mowed the lawn, fixed broken light bulbs, took out the trash. He insisted I shouldn't worry about anything. "You've spent your whole life taking care of everyone else," he told me. "Now let me take care of you." Those words wrapped around my broken heart like a warm blanket. A few months later, Ethan brought up an idea. What if Lauren and the kids moved in for a while? I explained that housing prices were ridiculous. They could save money. I wouldn't be alone. The grandchildren would fill the house with life again. It sounded perfect. No mother imagines that saying yes to her son could one day become the worst decision of her life. The first year was wonderful. Noah filled the backyard with baseballs. Emma turned my flower beds into fairy kingdoms using painted rocks. Lauren cooked elegant dinners twice a week. Ethan repaired everything that broke before I even noticed it. The house felt alive again. Sometimes I'd sit quietly on the back porch listening to everyone laughing inside. I'd whisper toward the sky, "Thomas, you'd love this." If there were warning signs, they arrived wearing friendly faces. One afternoon, Ethan asked whether he could help organize my online banking. "It's safer," he explained. "Scammers target seniors every day." That sounded reasonable. I gave him access. A month later, he suggested switching all household bills to automatic payments. "It'll make life easier." Again, reasonable. Then he offered to collect the mail because he usually got home first. Then he started answering calls from insurance companies. Then he handled property tax notices. Little by little, responsibility became control. But it never felt like control. It felt like kindness. Or at least that's what I believed. Sometimes I'd ask about a bill. He'd smile. I already handled it. I'd ask whether something had arrived in the mail. Nothing important. Eventually, I stopped asking altogether. After all, he was my son. One Saturday morning, I searched for the folder containing our mortgage papers. I wanted to show Noah how his grandfather had carefully documented every payment over 30 years. The folder wasn't where I'd always kept it. I looked through every drawer in my bedroom. Nothing. When Ethan came home that evening, I mentioned it casually. "Oh," he said. "I moved all those old papers into a safer filing cabinet downstairs." He answered so naturally that I didn't question him. Looking back now, I wish I had. Months later, I noticed another small change. The mailbox key was no longer hanging beside the kitchen calendar. Lauren smiled. "Ethan keeps it now." Again, no explanation. Again, I accepted it. I told myself this was simply what happened when generations shared a home. The younger people naturally handled modern responsibilities, didn't they? Still, there were moments that lingered in my thoughts longer than they should have. I'd walk into the kitchen and conversations would suddenly stop. Lauren would quickly change the subject. Ethan would smile a little too broadly. "No big deal, Mom." Once I found them studying papers spread across the dining room table. As soon as I entered, Lauren stacked everything into a folder. "We're just working on taxes." I apologized for interrupting. Imagine that, apologizing inside my own dining room. At church, my closest friend Helen asked whether I enjoyed having everyone living together. "I do," I answered honestly. "It gets lonely after losing Thomas." She squeezed my hand. "Just promise me something." "What?" "Don't disappear inside your own home." I laughed. "I won't." But I already had. I simply didn't know it yet. Every compromise seemed too small to matter. Every unanswered question seemed too insignificant to ask again. Trust has a quiet way of making us overlook what fear would immediately recognize. I believed my son was protecting me. I never imagined he was slowly becoming the gatekeeper to a life that had once belonged entirely to me. And by the time I realized how many doors had quietly closed behind me, I no longer knew which ones I still had the right to open. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder whether people notice the moment they begin disappearing. Not physically, emotionally. One day, you still have a voice in your own home. The next decisions happen around you instead of with you. Nobody announces the change. There isn't an argument or a dramatic confrontation. It's quieter than that. You simply become someone everyone politely works around. That was exactly what happened to me. For months after Ethan and Lauren moved in, our evenings followed the same comfortable rhythm. We'd eat dinner together. Noah would tell us stories about middle school baseball. Emma would proudly display whatever craft project she'd made at school, and afterward we'd sit in the living room watching old movies. Those nights became my favorite part of every week. I honestly believed we had found a way to turn grief into something beautiful. Then the little traditions began disappearing. At first, I barely noticed. One Tuesday afternoon, I came home from my volunteer shift at the public library, carrying a stack of donated children's books I planned to repair. As I stepped through the front door, laughter drifted from the dining room. For a moment I smiled. Family dinners in the middle of the week had always been Thomas's favorite idea, but when I walked toward the dining room, the laughter stopped almost instantly. Ethan looked up. "Oh, Mom." Lauren quickly folded a sheet of paper and slipped it into a leather folder beside her chair. Noah lowered his eyes. Emma offered me the innocent smile only a 10-year-old could give. "Hi, Grandma." I looked around the table. Coffee mugs, legal pads, a laptop, several folders. "What are you all working on?" I asked. Lauren answered before Ethan could. "Just some budgeting," she smiled warmly. "The boring adult stuff." I laughed politely. "Then I'll stay out of your way." I carried my books upstairs, but something about the exchange lingered with me long after dinner. Not because they were discussing finances. Families did that all the time. It was how quickly everything disappeared the moment I entered, as though my presence required the conversation to end. A week later, I noticed another small change. Our monthly utility bill usually arrived around the 10th of every month. For decades, I'd opened it while drinking my morning coffee. That month, it never appeared. One afternoon, I asked Ethan if perhaps the mail had been delayed. "Oh," he replied casually, "I already took care of it." "When did it come?" "A few days ago." "I never saw it." He shrugged. "I didn't think it mattered." He smiled as though he had saved me unnecessary work. I smiled back. But inside something shifted. Not anger, not suspicion, just an unfamiliar feeling that I had missed part of my own life. The following Sunday after church, Helen Carter and I stayed behind to help clean the fellowship hall. Helen had been one of my closest friends for nearly 25 years. She noticed things most people overlooked. As we folded tablecloths, she glanced toward me. "You seem tired." I laughed. "I guess I'm getting older." "No." She shook her head. "That's not what I meant." She waited until the room emptied before speaking again. "Are you happy with everyone living together?" The question surprised me. "Of course." She smiled gently. "You answered too quickly." I looked down at the tablecloth in my hands. "I enjoy having the children around." "I didn't ask about the children." Her words settled quietly between us. Then she added something I didn't fully understand until much later. "Sometimes women spend their whole lives making room for everyone else. And they forget they deserve room too." I changed the subject. I wish I hadn't. Over the next month, little inconveniences became regular occurrences. I'd reach for the mailbox key hanging beside the kitchen calendar. Gone. Lauren explained that Ethan carried it now because he usually arrived home first. Reasonable. I searched for the binder containing homeowners' insurance documents. Ethan had reorganized the filing system downstairs. Reasonable. I tried logging into my online banking account. The password no longer worked. "Ethan probably updated the security settings," Lauren suggested. Reasonable. Every explanation sounded reasonable. Individually, none of them deserved an argument. Together, they quietly erased my independence. One Saturday afternoon, Noah found me trimming roses in the backyard. He stood beside me silently for several minutes. "What are you thinking about?" I asked. He shrugged. "Nothing." Teenagers often answered that way. I smiled and kept trimming. A minute later, he spoke again. "Grandma?" "Yes." "Do you ever think grown-ups keep secrets because they're scared?" The question caught me off guard. I suppose sometimes they do. He nodded without looking at me. What if the secret hurts someone? I set down the pruning shears. Did something happen? He kicked at the grass. I don't know. His voice became almost a whisper. I just don't like it when Mom and Dad tell Emma and me to leave the room. I waited. He looked toward the house. They've been doing that a lot. What do they talk about? I don't know, he hesitated. But every time your name comes up. He stopped speaking. I reached out and squeezed his shoulder. You don't have to worry about adult conversations. He looked relieved, then guilty. I'm sorry. For what? I shouldn't have said anything. He hurried back toward the house before I could ask another question. That conversation replayed in my mind for days. Not because Noah had told me anything specific, because he hadn't. Children rarely understand adult problems, but they always understand tension. Several days later, Emma wandered into my bedroom while I was organizing old family photographs. She picked up one of Thomas holding Ethan on his shoulders at the county fair. Grandma. Yes, sweetheart. She pointed toward my dresser. When Daddy makes his office. She stopped suddenly. I looked up. What office? Her eyes widened. I wasn't supposed to say. I smiled reassuringly. It's okay. She shook her head vigorously. No. Then she ran from the room. Office, what office? That evening I asked Ethan whether he had been thinking about working from home more often. He looked confused for only a fraction of a second. Then he smiled. Maybe someday. I watched his face carefully. It was the same smile I'd seen since he was 6 years old, whenever he'd tried convincing me he hadn't eaten cookies before dinner. Only, this time, he was 40 years old. The following weekend I came downstairs earlier than usual. Voices drifted from the dining room. Lauren was speaking. If we open that wall, the entire first floor feels bigger, Ethan answered quietly. The bedroom downstairs becomes available. What about storage? We'll figure something out. I stepped into the room. Silence. Lauren immediately rolled up a set of papers. Blueprints. I knew enough from Thomas's years of home improvement projects to recognize architectural drawings. What are those? I asked. Lauren smiled. Oh, just renovation ideas. For whose house? She laughed lightly. For ours someday. Something about that sentence stayed with me long after breakfast. Not because she had said our, but because she hadn't corrected herself. As if somewhere in her mind the future had already been decided. A few days later, I stood in the hallway, looking at the family photographs Thomas had carefully arranged years before. Our wedding, Ethan's high school graduation, Christmas mornings, vacations, anniversaries. Only. Several frames were gone. The empty spaces on the wall were impossible to ignore. I found Lauren in the kitchen. Did you move some pictures? Oh. She barely looked up from her phone. They didn't match the new color ideas. I frowned. What new color ideas? For when we repaint. She said it so naturally, so confidently, as though repainting my home was already scheduled, as though asking my opinion had never crossed her mind. I stood there for several seconds, not angry, not yet, just unsettled. For the first time since Thomas died, I walked through every room in the house not as its owner, but as someone quietly wondering whether everyone else had already decided she no longer belonged there. And although I still couldn't see the entire picture, I could finally feel its shadow. If someone had asked me a year earlier whether my own son would ever try to convince me to leave the home his father and I had spent nearly 4 decades building, I would have laughed. Not because Ethan was perfect. No child is. But because there are some lines a mother never imagines her child could cross. The trouble with betrayal is that it almost never arrives looking like betrayal. It introduces itself as concern, as practicality, as love. The first brochure appeared on a rainy Thursday afternoon. I had just finished baking an apple pie, using the same recipe Thomas's mother had written on an index card nearly 50 years earlier. The house smelled of cinnamon butter and baked apples. Emma sat at the kitchen island coloring pictures while Noah worked quietly on his math homework. It felt like an ordinary day. Then Ethan walked in carrying a glossy envelope. "Mom," he said cheerfully, "can we talk for a minute?" Of course. Lauren joined us moments later carrying coffee mugs for everyone. That should have been my first clue. She almost never drank coffee after lunch. Ethan placed several colorful brochures on the kitchen table. Across the front were smiling gray-haired couples walking through beautiful gardens. One brochure showed seniors playing pickleball. Another featured a modern apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a lake. The words at the top read Maple Ridge Active Senior Living. I looked from the brochures to Ethan. "What's this?" "I thought you'd like to see some options." Options. Lauren leaned forward with her usual calm smile. "We've been talking about how much work this house requires." I laughed softly. "I've managed it for almost 40 years. "But you're not 40 anymore," she answered gently. There wasn't any cruelty in her voice. That somehow made it sting even more. Ethan reached across the table and placed his hand over mine. "Mom, we're worried." "About what?" "The stairs." I looked toward the staircase. "I climb them every day." "The yard." "I enjoy gardening." "The maintenance." "I've always managed," he sighed. "You don't have to keep proving you're capable." I stared at him. I wasn't trying to prove anything. Lauren opened one of the brochures. "They have fitness classes, art workshops, transportation, medical staff, housekeeping." She listed each feature as though presenting the perfect vacation. "They even have a book club," she added, knowing how much I loved reading. For a brief moment, guilt crept into my heart. Were they truly trying to help? Was I being stubborn, simply because I disliked change? Then I remembered something Thomas used to tell his students when he coached Little League. If someone keeps selling you a solution to a problem you don't have, they're solving their problem, not yours. I closed the brochure. "I appreciate your concern. I really do. But I'm not interested." Ethan forced a smile. "You don't have to decide today." "I already have." The conversation ended politely. Or so I thought. Over the following weeks, it returned again and again, never as an argument, always as a suggestion. Every few days, another brochure appeared. Different communities, different floor plans, different smiling elderly couples enjoying retirement. Lauren left one beside my breakfast plate. Another appeared on my bedside table. One somehow found its way inside the novel I had borrowed from the library. I finally gathered all of them into a stack and placed them in a kitchen drawer. The next morning, there was another one. I began feeling as though someone was quietly advertising my replacement. One Saturday morning, Ethan asked whether I wanted to ride with him to the hardware store. I welcomed the chance to spend time together. For months, our conversations had become increasingly practical. Bills, groceries, appointments. I missed simply talking to my son. As we drove across town, he seemed unusually distracted. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Mom, yes. Have you ever thought about traveling?" I smiled. "Your father always wanted us to visit Maine. We never had the chance. You could still go. Maybe. You'd have more freedom if you weren't tied to this house." I looked out the passenger window. "This house isn't tying me down. It's where your father still feels close." He gripped the steering wheel more tightly. "You know Dad wouldn't want you living alone forever." "I'm not alone. You know what I mean." Actually, I wasn't sure I did anymore. A few days later, I noticed two unfamiliar pickup trucks parked in front of our house. Three men wearing contractor shirts walked through the front yard measuring windows. One of them carried a clipboard. Another held a laser measuring tool. I walked outside. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" They exchanged confused looks. Finally, one asked, "We're here to provide renovation estimates." "For whom?" He glanced toward the driveway. "The homeowner." Just then, Ethan stepped out of the garage. "It's okay, Mom." I asked them to stop by. I looked back at the workers. "What renovations?" "We're just exploring ideas." I frowned. "For this house?" "Well," he hesitated. "It never hurts to plan ahead." I watched the men continue measuring my windows. None of them asked my permission. None of them even seemed to realize the woman standing in front of them actually owned the property. That realization settled heavily in my chest. Not because of the contractors. Because Ethan hadn't introduced me. He hadn't said, "This is my mother's house." Instead, he spoke as though he were already making the decisions. That evening, I wandered through every room after everyone had gone to bed. The living room where Thomas proposed to me beside our first Christmas tree. The kitchen where Ethan spilled an entire gallon of chocolate milk when he was 8 and cried because he thought we'd be angry. The guest room where Noah slept during thunderstorms because he liked hearing rain on the roof. The hallway where Emma measured herself against the same growth marks her father had used decades earlier. I rested my hand against the dining room wall. Thomas and I had painted it together one Thanksgiving weekend. We had argued over the shade of beige for nearly 2 hours. He insisted my choice looked too yellow. I insisted his looked gray. We laughed about that argument for years. Standing there now, I suddenly imagined strangers tearing down that very wall. Not because it needed replacing, because someone else wanted a different floor plan. The thought made me physically ill. The following week, another strange thing happened. I returned home from grocery shopping earlier than expected. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed Lauren standing with a woman I had never met. The woman carried a tablet and wore a blazer with a local real estate company's logo embroidered on the pocket. They were walking slowly around the property, pointing, discussing something. Lauren saw my car and immediately ended the conversation. The woman smiled politely before driving away. When I entered the house, I asked Lauren who she was. "Oh," she answered almost too quickly. "Just someone gathering neighborhood information." "For what?" She opened the refrigerator. "Property values." "Why?" Lauren shrugged. "I was curious." That explanation might have satisfied me months earlier. Now, it only created more questions. That night, after everyone had gone upstairs, I walked into Thomas's old workshop in the garage. Most of his tools still hung exactly where he had left them. His workbench remained covered with tiny scratches from decades of weekend projects. I sat alone on the old wooden stool he used every Saturday morning. For the first time since his funeral, I spoke aloud as though he were sitting beside me. "I don't understand what's happening." The workshop remained silent. But as I looked around, I noticed something Thomas had carved into the corner of the workbench many years before. Just 3 simple words: "Protect what's precious." At the time he carved them, he had been talking about furniture. Looking at those words now, I wondered if perhaps they had been meant for something much bigger. Because deep inside, a quiet voice had begun whispering something I desperately didn't want to believe. This wasn't about my comfort, it wasn't about my safety, and it certainly wasn't about my happiness. Whatever Ethan and Lauren were planning, it had already begun. There are moments in life that divide everything into 2 chapters: before and after. For me, that moment arrived on an ordinary Friday evening in October. The maple trees lining our street had already turned shades of crimson and gold. A cool breeze carried dry leaves across the driveway as I pulled my old Honda into the garage after spending the afternoon repairing children's books at the public library. Nothing about the evening felt unusual. I carried 2 grocery bags inside, expecting to hear Emma practicing the piano or Noah laughing at one of the baseball videos he watched almost every afternoon. Instead, the house was silent. Not peaceful, silent. The kind of silence that immediately tells you something is wrong. I set the grocery bags on the kitchen counter. Ethan. No answer. Lauren. Nothing. I walked toward the living room. Both of them were sitting on the sofa. Neither was watching television. Neither had a book. Neither even looked surprised to see me. It was as though they had been waiting. Lauren folded her hands neatly in her lap. Ethan stood slowly. His face carried an expression I had never seen before. Not anger, not sadness, just determination. A cold, exhausted determination. "Mom," he said quietly, "we need to talk." My stomach tightened. Whenever someone begins a conversation with those words, almost nothing good follows. I forced a smile. "Did something happen?" He nodded once. "Please sit down." I remained standing. "I'd rather hear it first." For several seconds, no one spoke. Finally, Ethan took a deep breath. You can't stay here anymore. I blinked. I'm sorry. Lauren looked toward the floor. Ethan repeated himself. You need to sleep somewhere else tonight. I laughed. Not because anything was funny, because my mind refused to understand the sentence. What do you mean? I mean, he swallowed. You need to leave. I looked from him to Lauren, expecting one of them to smile and explain that this was some terrible misunderstanding. Neither did. Instead, Lauren quietly stood and walked toward the front hallway. She returned pulling my large navy blue suitcase. The same suitcase Thomas and I had used on our 25th wedding anniversary trip to Vermont. She placed it beside the front door. Already packed, every zipper closed, every handle neatly folded. I stared at it. When did you pack that? Lauren answered softly. This afternoon. You went into my bedroom. We packed everything carefully. Everything. The word echoed inside my head. I walked past them without another sentence. My bedroom door stood open. The room looked wrong. The framed photograph of Thomas on my dresser was gone. My favorite quilt had been folded into a storage box. Half the closet hung empty. The jewelry box my mother had given me years earlier had disappeared. Even the reading lamp beside my chair was missing. I opened the closet. Several empty hangers swung gently. Someone had already decided which pieces of my life I was allowed to keep. I hurried downstairs again. What is this? Ethan rubbed both hands across his face. We've already talked about this. No. We talked about brochures. We talked about retirement communities. We never talked about throwing me out of my own bedroom. Lauren finally spoke. Please don't make this harder than it has to be. I turned toward her. Harder. She nodded. This decision wasn't easy. I almost laughed again. Not because it was funny. Because I suddenly realized they believed they were the ones making the difficult sacrifice. Ethan! My voice shook. Tell me exactly what's happening. He took another deep breath. We've found a place for you. A place. Maple Ridge. I stared at him. The retirement community. It's temporary. No. You'll like it. No. They have excellent care. I don't need care. They have activities. I have a life. They'll help you settle in. I'm already settled. Every answer I gave seemed to bounce harmlessly off invisible walls. Neither of them actually listened. It felt as though the conversation had already happened somewhere else, without me. I looked toward the staircase. Where are Noah and Emma? Lauren answered immediately. They're spending the night with my sister. Of course they were. They had removed every witness. I felt a wave of nausea. You planned this. No one answered. You planned all of this while I was gone today. Still nothing. I looked directly into Ethan's eyes. How long? He lowered his head. What? How long have you been planning to remove me from my own house? His silence gave me the answer. Long enough. I slowly walked into the dining room. The family photographs that had decorated one wall for nearly 30 years were gone. Only pale rectangles remained where sunlight had protected the paint behind each frame. The wall looked strangely empty, like someone had erased our history. I reached for the edge of the dining table to steady myself. This is your father's house. Ethan looked up. It was. No. It still is. He shook his head. Things change. I whispered, not memories. He didn't answer. Instead, he walked toward a folder lying on the coffee table. He picked it up. We've already spoken to people. What people? There are documents. What documents? Everything has been reviewed. His words were carefully chosen, vague, confident, designed to end questions instead of answering them. I held out my hand. Show me. He hesitated, then handed me the folder. Inside were brochures, maps, admission forms for Maple Ridge, a checklist titled Move-In Preparation. None of it carried my signature. None of it had even been shown to me before today. I looked back at Ethan. You filled these out. They're only preliminary. You used my personal information. We were trying to make things easier. Easier. There was that word again. I closed the folder. I am not leaving. Lauren sighed quietly. We were hoping you wouldn't say that. I don't care what you were hoping. I walked toward the hallway closet where we always kept spare house keys. When I opened the small drawer, it was empty. I frowned. Ethan? He slowly reached into his pocket. Without speaking, he placed a small ring of keys on top of my suitcase. My spare keys. He nodded. They're yours. What about the ones I've always used? We changed the locks this afternoon. For several seconds. The room disappeared around me. Not physically, emotionally. Everything I had believed about my family seemed to collapse at once. You changed. I could barely speak. The locks. It was necessary. Necessary. So things wouldn't become complicated. I stared at my own son. The little boy who once cried because he accidentally broke my favorite coffee mug. The teenager who hugged me after every baseball game, win or lose. The young man who stood beside me at Thomas's funeral, promising I would never be alone. Now he was calmly explaining why changing the locks on my home had been necessary. I whispered, "Where exactly do you expect me to sleep tonight?" Ethan looked away. "Maple Ridge has a room ready." I never agreed. "You don't really have another choice." At that exact moment, a bright light suddenly flooded through the living room windows. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, the entire front yard was illuminated so brightly, it almost looked like daylight. Lauren jumped. "What was that?" Ethan rushed toward the front window, his face drained of color. "No," he whispered. "No, not tonight." I stepped beside him. Outside, beneath the brilliant floodlights surrounding my property, dozens of figures stood silently across the front lawn. Some were neighbors. Some I couldn't immediately recognize. No one moved. No one spoke. They simply stood there, watching. And for the first time that evening, it wasn't me who looked afraid. It was my son. For one long, disorienting moment, none of us moved. The floodlights surrounding the front yard burned so brightly that every tree, every flower bed, every brick along the walkway looked unnaturally sharp. The shadows that usually softened the evening had disappeared, replaced by harsh white light that exposed everything, including us. I wasn't looking at the people outside. I was looking at Ethan. Only seconds earlier, he had been completely certain of himself. He had spoken with the confidence of a man convinced that every detail had been planned, every obstacle removed. Now all of that confidence vanished. His shoulders stiffened, his breathing quickened. And for the first time that evening, I saw fear in my son's eyes. Lauren stepped beside him and whispered, "Who's out there?" "I don't know," Ethan answered. It was a lie. I knew it before he finished the sentence. He recognized exactly what he was seeing. He simply hadn't expected it. Another knock echoed through the front door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Nobody inside the house moved. The knock came again, this time louder. Lauren grabbed Ethan's arm. "Don't answer it." He didn't respond. I looked from one of them to the other. "What are you afraid of?" Neither answered. Outside, I could now distinguish individual faces through the large picture window. Richard Lawson stood closest to the walkway, his hands folded calmly in front of him. Richard had lived next door for nearly 20 years. A retired police detective, he had always been the sort of neighbor who quietly shoveled your driveway before dawn after a heavy snowfall and never expected anyone to notice. Beside him stood Helen Carter. She held her coat tightly around her shoulders, her expression filled with concern. Behind Helen was Pastor David Brooks. Then several members of our church. Then the Hendersons from across the street. The Millers, Mrs. Ortiz, even 2 of my former students, now adults with families of their own. There were at least 20 people standing in my yard. No one looked angry. No one shouted. They simply waited. Another vehicle slowly pulled to the curb, a dark gray sedan. The driver's door opened. An older man stepped out carrying a black leather document case. Even from the window, I recognized him immediately. Michael Reynolds, my attorney. More importantly, Thomas's closest friend for over 40 years. I hadn't seen Michael in nearly 3 months. He had been traveling to help his daughter recover from surgery in Arizona. Seeing him standing in front of my house made absolutely no sense, unless my thoughts stopped there. The doorbell rang. Ethan remained frozen. Finally, I walked toward the door. Before my hand reached the knob, Ethan stepped in front of me. "You don't need to answer." I looked at him. "This is still my front door." His jaw tightened. I said, "Don't." For a brief second, neither of us moved. Then Richard's voice came through the closed door. "Mrs. Murray." His calm voice carried clearly. "It's Richard. We're here for you. Not, we're here because of you. Not, we're here to interfere. Simply, we're here for you." Something inside me broke. Not from sadness, from relief. Until that moment, I hadn't realized how completely alone I had felt. Someone had noticed. Someone had believed something was wrong. Someone had come. I gently moved Ethan aside. He didn't resist. I opened the front door. Cool October air rushed into the house. For several seconds, no one spoke. Richard removed his cap. "Good evening, Chloe." I tried to answer. Nothing came out. Helen stepped forward first. Without asking permission, she wrapped both arms around me. I felt myself beginning to shake. "Oh, Chloe," she whispered. "We were afraid we'd be too late." Too late, I pulled back just enough to look at her. "What do you mean?" Before she could answer, Michael Reynolds approached the porch. His gray hair looked slightly thinner than the last time I'd seen him, but his steady eyes hadn't changed. He held up the black leather case. "Chloe, it's good to see you. What are you doing here?" His expression grew serious. "I think we should all go inside." Ethan immediately stepped forward. "That's not necessary." Michael turned toward him. "It absolutely is. This is a family matter." Michael's voice remained calm. "It stopped being only a family matter some time ago." Lauren folded her arms. "You can't just walk into someone's house." Michael looked directly at her. "Actually," he paused, "I've been invited." She frowned. "By whom?" Michael's eyes met mine. "By Chloe." I stared at him in confusion. "I didn't—" He smiled faintly. "Not today." Several months ago. Then I remembered. Nearly 6 months earlier, before Michael left for Arizona, we had lunch together after church. As we finished eating, he had laughed and said, "If you ever need legal advice, my front door is always open." I had teased him by replying, "Then consider yourself permanently invited to mine." At the time, it had simply been an old friendship exchanging familiar words. I never imagined those words would matter. Michael stepped into the entryway. Richard followed. Then Pastor David. Helen remained beside me. No one else entered. The neighbors stayed respectfully outside, watching, waiting, supporting. Inside, the atmosphere changed immediately. The confidence Ethan and Lauren had displayed only minutes earlier seemed to dissolve. Michael placed the leather case carefully on the dining room table. He did not open it immediately. Instead, he turned toward me. "Chloe, I need to ask you one question." I nodded. "Have you voluntarily agreed to leave this house tonight?" "No." "Have you signed any document transferring ownership?" "No." "Have you signed any admission paperwork for Maple Ridge?" "No." He nodded once. "That's what I expected." Ethan finally spoke. "You don't know the whole situation." Michael looked at him calmly. "I know enough." "You've only heard one side." Michael folded his hands. "No. I've been listening to several sides." That sentence landed like a stone. Ethan's face paled. Michael continued. "For weeks." Silence. Lauren looked toward Ethan. "For weeks." She sounded surprised. Apparently, she hadn't known that either. Michael slowly opened the leather case. Inside were several neatly organized folders, a sealed envelope, and what appeared to be certified copies of legal documents. I had never seen them before. Michael rested one hand gently on the top folder, but did not open it yet. "There are some things," he said quietly, "that Thomas wanted protected." My heart skipped. Thomas. Ethan immediately interrupted. "This has nothing to do with Dad." Michael looked directly into his eyes. "I wouldn't be so certain." Richard remained standing near the doorway. His arms were crossed, but his expression stayed neutral, almost professional. The habit of a police detective never truly leaves a person. Pastor David quietly placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. "You're not alone tonight." Those 5 words carried more strength than I can describe, because for months, I had begun believing every uncomfortable feeling existed only inside my imagination. That perhaps I really was becoming forgetful. Perhaps I was overreacting. Perhaps I simply struggled accepting change. Now I looked around the room. Richard, Michael, Pastor David, Helen. 4 people I had trusted for decades. None of them looked surprised. Concerned. Yes. Heartbroken. Certainly. But surprised, no. Which meant one thing. They had seen pieces of this story long before I had. I looked toward Michael again. "Please." My voice trembled. "Tell me what's happening." He rested his hand gently on the sealed envelope. "I will. But before I do," he turned toward Ethan. "I think your father deserves to be part of this conversation." Ethan's face lost every trace of color. "What does that mean?" Michael looked back at me. "It means—" He took a slow breath. Thomas prepared for something he hoped would never happen. The room fell completely silent, and for the second time that night, I realized everything I believed about my family was about to change forever. No one spoke. The silence inside the dining room felt almost sacred, as though even the walls understood that whatever happened next would change every life standing there. Michael Reynolds rested both hands on the black leather document case. He had been Thomas's attorney for more than 30 years, but before that, he had simply been my husband's closest friend. They met during their first year of law school. Thomas eventually chose engineering. Michael stayed with the law. Their careers changed. Their friendship never did. I watched Michael's weathered hands move carefully as he unlocked the brass clasps on the case. He wasn't rushing. I wasn't trying to create drama. He simply understood that some truths deserved to be handled with respect. Inside were several neatly labeled folders. He removed one marked in Thomas's unmistakable handwriting. Property documents. Seeing my husband's handwriting after 6 years felt like hearing his voice unexpectedly in another room. My knees weakened. Pastor David quietly pulled out a chair. "Sit down, Chloe." I nodded gratefully. Across the table, Ethan remained standing. His arms were folded tightly across his chest. Lauren stood beside him, but for the first time since this nightmare began, she looked uncertain. She glanced repeatedly between Michael and Ethan, as though she suddenly realized there were parts of this story she had never been told. Michael carefully slid a thick envelope toward me. "Before we discuss the legal documents," he said softly, "Thomas asked that you read this first." My fingers trembled as I picked it up. Across the front, written in blue ink, were just 6 words. "For Chloe, if she ever needs this." The handwriting was unmistakably Thomas's. I swallowed hard. "I can't—" "Yes," Michael said gently. "You can." I slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter on cream-colored stationery. The paper had yellowed slightly with age. I recognized it immediately. Thomas had always written important letters on that stationery. I unfolded the pages. For a moment my vision blurred with tears. Then I began reading. "My dearest Chloe, if you're reading this, something has happened that I prayed never would. First, know this before anything else: none of what you're facing is your fault. You have always believed the best about people. That's one of the reasons I fell in love with you. Never apologize for having a generous heart." My breathing caught. Those were exactly the words Thomas would have chosen. Simple, honest, gentle. I continued. "I know you may wonder why I prepared these documents instead of simply trusting everything would work itself out. The answer is easy. I trusted you completely. I trusted Ethan deeply. But life changes people when fear and money begin speaking louder than conscience." Across the table, Ethan lowered his eyes. Michael remained silent. The only sound in the room was the rustle of paper as I turned to the next page. "This isn't because I expect our son to become dishonest. It is because I have spent my career watching good people make terrible decisions when they convince themselves those decisions are temporary. My tears finally escaped. Thomas had never judged people harshly, even now. His words carried sadness rather than anger. The letter continued. If someone ever asks you to leave the home we built together against your wishes, I want you to remember one thing. That house was never simply a building. It was our promise to each other. No one has the right to take that promise away from you. I pressed the letter against my chest. For several seconds I couldn't continue. Helen quietly handed me a tissue. When I looked back at the pages, one paragraph immediately caught my attention. Michael is holding documents that explain everything. Trust him the way you trusted me. I slowly lowered the letter. The room remained completely silent. Michael waited until I nodded before speaking again. Thomas wrote that letter approximately 18 months before he passed away. I stared at him. He was already sick. Michael nodded. He knew he didn't have much time. I looked down at the pages again. He never told me. He didn't want you spending his remaining months worrying about legal paperwork. That sounded exactly like Thomas, always protecting everyone else first. Michael opened the folder marked Property Documents. Inside were several certified copies. He placed the first document on the table. This is the recorded deed. I recognized our names immediately. Thomas Murray and Chloe Murray, joint tenants with rights of survivorship. Michael continued. When Thomas passed away, ownership transferred entirely to you. I nodded. I knew that. He slid another document forward. This is the updated county record confirming sole ownership. Again, only my name appeared. Owner Chloe Elizabeth Murray. Michael looked toward Ethan. Your name has never appeared on this property. Ethan finally spoke. I know that. Do you? Michael asked calmly. Because your recent actions suggest otherwise. Lauren turned sharply toward Ethan. What does he mean? Ethan didn't answer. Michael removed another folder. This contains every attempt made during the past year involving this property's financial records. My heartbeat quickened. What attempts? He opened the folder. Loan inquiries. Mortgage discussions. Property valuation requests. Refinancing consultations. Each sentence felt heavier than the last. I looked at Ethan. He stared at the floor. Ethan. Still. Nothing. Michael continued. None of these applications were approved. Why? I asked. Because every institution reached the same conclusion. He tapped the ownership documents. The applicant wasn't the owner. Lauren's face lost its color. She looked at Ethan again. You told me. She stopped speaking. Apparently, he had told her something entirely different. Michael remained composed. No bank transferred ownership. No title company altered ownership. No lender accepted ownership. Legally, he paused deliberately. This home has belonged to Chloe Murray, and only Chloe Murray since Thomas passed away. I looked around the room. Everything suddenly became painfully clear. The brochures, the contractors, the real estate agent, the missing paperwork, the changed locks. They hadn't been acting like owners because they legally were. They had been acting like owners because they expected I would simply surrender. Michael opened one final envelope. This is the last document Thomas asked me to keep. He slid it toward me. It wasn't legal paperwork. It was another handwritten note. Only one sentence. Never let anyone convince you that kindness requires surrendering your dignity. My vision blurred again. I whispered, he knew. Michael nodded slowly. He didn't know this would happen. But he knew it could. Pastor David finally broke the silence. Thomas loved both of you. He looked first at me, then at Ethan. He hoped none of us would ever need these papers. Richard Lawson, who had remained quietly near the doorway, spoke for the first time. I think it's time everyone hears the rest. I frowned. The rest. Richard looked toward Michael. Michael gave a slow nod. Richard folded his arms. For the last several months, he looked directly at Ethan. I've been watching. The room became silent once again. I stared at Richard in confusion. What do you mean? He answered with the calm certainty of someone who had spent decades gathering facts before speaking. I mean, I started noticing things that didn't make sense. And once I did, I never stopped paying attention. I suddenly realized Thomas's documents had only protected my ownership. Someone else had been protecting me, without my ever knowing it. The room remained so quiet that I could hear the old grandfather clock in the hallway ticking. Tick, tick, tick. Each second seemed louder than the last. Richard Lawson looked around the dining room before pulling a thin manila folder from inside his jacket. I spent 32 years as a detective, he began calmly. Old habits don't disappear after retirement. No one interrupted him. When something feels wrong, I pay attention. He placed the folder beside Michael's documents. I wasn't looking for trouble. He glanced at me. I was looking out for my neighbor. I felt another wave of emotion rise in my chest. For months I had believed no one saw what was happening. I had been wrong. Richard continued. The first thing that caught my attention happened about 4 months ago. He looked toward Ethan. A moving truck. Ethan remained silent. It parked outside your house on a Tuesday afternoon. Richard spoke without anger, almost as though he were presenting evidence in court. It stayed for nearly 2 hours. I frowned. I remember that. Ethan quickly answered. We were getting rid of old furniture. Richard nodded. That's what you told me. He opened the folder. So I reviewed my security footage. Lauren's head snapped toward him. Security footage. My cameras cover my driveway. He paused. They also happen to cover most of yours. No one spoke. I watched the recording several times. He slid several printed photographs across the dining table. I picked up the first one. It showed 2 movers carrying my antique cedar chest from the garage. The same chest Thomas had built during our 10th wedding anniversary. I looked at Ethan. I thought you said they were removing broken shelves. He didn't answer. Richard continued. The movers didn't take those items to a donation center. They placed everything in a commercial storage truck. I slowly turned to the next photograph. There was my oak rocking chair, then Thomas's workbench drawers, then several sealed boxes labeled in Ethan's handwriting. Master bedroom. My hands began shaking again. When was this? 3 weeks ago, Richard replied. I hadn't even known. They moved my belongings while I was volunteering. Richard nodded. During the hours you were usually away. Lauren stared at Ethan. You told me she agreed. He still said nothing. Richard continued. I didn't interfere. Not yet. I assumed perhaps Chloe knew. He looked directly at me. But then more things started happening. He removed another group of photographs. Contractors measuring windows. A locksmith working at the front door. 2 men replacing deadbolts. Another technician installing electronic locks. I remembered that afternoon. Ethan had told me they were repairing sticky door latches. Instead, they had replaced every lock in the house. Pastor David quietly shook his head. Richard spoke again. That was the moment I became concerned. Why? I asked. Because homeowners usually stand nearby when someone changes every lock. You weren't home. His words settled heavily over the room. I knocked on Ethan's door the next morning. What did you ask? Michael said. I simply asked whether Chloe knew. Everyone looked toward Ethan. Richard answered before Ethan could. He smiled and said yes. I closed my eyes. Another lie. Another quiet betrayal. Richard reached into the folder again. I still wasn't convinced something illegal had happened. So I kept watching. This time he placed several printed screenshots on the table. Each one showed a different day. Lauren walking with a real estate agent. Contractors entering the garage. Furniture being measured. Landscape designers walking the yard. Property photographers. I looked closely at one photograph. The woman from the real estate company. The one Lauren said was gathering neighborhood information. Richard nodded. I recognized her. How? My daughter sells commercial property. I've met her before. He looked toward Lauren. She wasn't gathering neighborhood information. Lauren's face turned pale. Richard continued. She was preparing a comparative market analysis. I turned toward Ethan. Were you planning to sell my house? No. His answer came immediately, too immediately. Michael quietly spoke, not directly. Everyone turned toward him. He opened another folder. This answers the next question. Inside were copies of bank correspondence, loan inquiries, mortgage requests, property valuations. I recognized the logo of a local credit union, then another regional bank, then a national lender. Michael slid one document toward me. Across the top were the words, "Application declined. Reason applicant does not hold legal title." I looked at Ethan. "How many?" Michael answered. "4 separate lending institutions." My heart sank. "He tried 4 times." Michael nodded. "Each application used projected home equity," Lauren whispered. "You told me they kept asking for additional paperwork." Michael looked toward her. "They did. Because they needed the owner's authorization." Lauren slowly backed into a chair. She looked as though she could barely breathe. "You said," she turned toward Ethan, "your mother had already agreed." Silence. "You said she wanted to downsize." Still nothing. "You said she was excited." Ethan stared at the floor. Lauren's voice cracked. "You lied to me too. For the first time that night, I realized something unexpected. Lauren had manipulated me. But Ethan had also manipulated Lauren. Not completely, not innocently, but enough that she no longer knew where the truth ended." Michael unfolded another document. This came from the final bank. He adjusted his glasses. The loan officer became concerned because the explanations changed every time ownership questions arose. Richard nodded. That's when Michael called me. I looked between them. "You two were working together." Michael smiled sadly. "Not against your family." "For you," Richard continued. "I drove by the house more often. I watched. I listened. And then," he hesitated, "I heard something." Everyone waited. "It was about 6 weeks ago. I was trimming hedges. The garage door happened to be open. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. But I clearly heard Ethan say," Richard looked directly at my son, "Once Mom moves, refinancing will be easy." The words echoed through the dining room. I couldn't breathe. Once Mom moves. Not if Mom decides. Not if Chloe agrees. Once. As though my leaving had never been optional. Richard continued quietly. "I knew then that something wasn't right. I contacted Michael immediately." Michael folded his hands. "I reviewed every public property record, every deed, every filing, every ownership document." He looked at me. "When everything confirmed you remained sole owner, I asked Richard to keep documenting whatever he observed. So that's what he did." Richard reached into the folder one final time. "This," he said, "is what convinced me tonight would happen." He placed a color photograph on the table. I recognized today's date printed in the corner. It showed my driveway, the moving truck, my packed suitcase, the locksmith's van, and Ethan standing beside both, taken only hours earlier. "I drove by this afternoon," Richard explained. "I saw your suitcase. I knew tonight was the night." He looked toward Helen. "So I called Michael. Michael called Pastor David. Pastor David called church members. No one wanted to create a scene. We simply refused to let you face it alone." I looked toward the front window. Outside through the glass, I could still see my neighbors standing patiently beneath the floodlights. No cameras, no shouting, no gossip. Just people willing to stand beside someone they cared about. Tears filled my eyes again. "I don't know how to thank all of you." Helen gently squeezed my hand. "You already have." "How?" "By spending 40 years loving this neighborhood." Pastor David smiled. "You taught half those adults outside when they were children." Richard nodded. "You attended funerals, delivered meals, babysat, volunteered. You've spent your entire life showing up for other people." He looked toward the window. "Tonight, they showed up for you." I lowered my head. For months I had believed my world had become smaller, that I had been forgotten, that I had become invisible. Standing in that dining room surrounded by evidence of betrayal, but also by undeniable proof of love, I finally understood something Thomas had always believed. A family is not defined only by blood. Sometimes, the people who stand beside you when your own family lets you fall become family too. And although the legal documents had already proven the house was still mine, the people gathered outside had reminded me of something even more valuable. I was not fighting this battle alone. I had always believed that truth was something dramatic. A confession, a courtroom verdict, a hidden letter discovered in the attic. Instead, I learned that truth often arrives one small piece at a time, quietly replacing the lies you had accepted as normal. After Richard finished explaining how he had documented everything he witnessed, no one in the dining room spoke for several moments. The silence wasn't empty, it was heavy. Every person in the room was trying to reconcile two versions of Ethan Murray. The little boy who used to race his bicycle up and down the driveway, while Thomas timed him with an old stopwatch. And the man who had packed his mother's suitcase before she came home from the library. I looked at my son. He still refused to meet my eyes. Michael closed one of the folders and spoke calmly. Ethan, this is the time to tell the truth. There isn't anything else to say. Michael didn't argue. Instead, he reached into the leather case and removed a slim envelope with the logo of a regional bank. I think there is. He handed it across the table. Ethan recognized it immediately. His shoulders stiffened. Lauren leaned toward him. What is it? He didn't answer. Michael answered instead. This is correspondence from the fourth bank. Lauren frowned. I thought there were only 3. There were 4. Michael adjusted his glasses. The first 3 simply declined the application. The fourth became concerned. He slid another document onto the table. Across the top in bold letters were the words, Fraud Prevention Review. My heart skipped. Fraud? Michael nodded gently. The bank didn't accuse anyone of committing fraud. They noticed inconsistencies. What inconsistencies? I asked. The applicant repeatedly described the property as if ownership were about to change. He looked at Ethan. But every legal document showed no transfer had occurred. Richard quietly added, the loan officer thought someone might be pressuring an elderly homeowner. Lauren turned sharply toward Ethan. You told me the banks were being difficult because interest rates changed. Ethan rubbed both hands across his face. I was trying to fix everything. No, Lauren replied. You were hiding everything. It was the first time that evening I had heard genuine anger in her voice. Not frustration, not defensiveness, anger. Michael continued before the argument could grow. The loan officer contacted me because my name appeared on earlier estate paperwork. I stared at him. They called you? Yes. They asked whether you had authorized any ownership changes. And I told them the truth. No. Michael's answer was firm. There had been no changes. I slowly exhaled. If that phone call had never happened, how much further would Ethan have gone? Michael seemed to read my thoughts. We'll never know. But after that conversation, I began reviewing every public filing connected to your property. He looked at me. That's when I realized someone had been requesting copies of surveys, tax assessments, and title records. Who? Michael didn't answer. Instead, he looked toward Ethan. My son finally spoke. I requested them. His voice was barely above a whisper. Why? Because. He stopped. Michael waited patiently. Finally, Ethan looked up. I thought if I had everything ready, Mom would eventually agree. I stared at him. You were planning my decision before I made it. He nodded once. I kept telling myself it wasn't stealing. It was just. He searched for the right words. Preparing. Preparing. The word sounded almost absurd. Preparing to remove me from my own home. Richard opened another folder. There was something else. He laid several printed photographs on the table. Unlike the earlier ones, these were clearly taken from his security camera at night. The timestamp showed they had been recorded just 2 weeks earlier. I leaned closer. The pictures showed Ethan walking into the detached garage after midnight. He wasn't alone. 2 men followed him. Neither wore company uniforms. What are they doing? I asked. Richard answered. They measured Thomas's workshop. I frowned. Measured it. Michael spoke quietly. The workshop cabinets. The built-in shelving. The antique tools. The cedar storage units. Lauren looked confused. Why would anyone measure those? Richard slid one final photograph toward us. It showed one of the men placing small numbered stickers on Thomas's woodworking equipment. Recognition hit me immediately. I had seen those stickers before. At estate sales, at auctions. I looked at Ethan. Were you? I couldn't finish the sentence. He closed his eyes. It wasn't finalized. Answer me. His voice cracked. Yes. The room fell silent again. You were going to auction your father's workshop. He whispered. I thought no one used it anymore. For a moment I couldn't speak. That workshop wasn't valuable because of the tools. It was valuable because it still smelled like sawdust and cedar. Because Thomas had taught Noah how to sand birdhouses there. Because Emma loved sitting on the old wooden stool pretending to help her grandfather she barely remembered. Some things don't have a price. Ethan had forgotten that. Pastor David stepped forward. Ethan. My son looked up. When did money become more important than memory? Ethan immediately shook his head. It didn't. It felt like survival. Richard quietly asked, survival from what? Another long silence. Then Ethan answered, debt. Only one word, but it changed the direction of the conversation. Michael opened yet another folder. I think it's time we discuss that. Lauren frowned. What debt? Ethan looked startled. You already know. No. I know about the credit cards. She folded her arms. I don't know about anything else. Michael slowly removed several financial summaries. I requested these after receiving Chloe's permission to review public filings. He looked at me apologetically. I wanted to understand why everything escalated so quickly. I nodded. I'm glad you did. He arranged the documents neatly. There are credit card balances, home improvement loans, vehicle financing. Those are significant. Then he placed one final page on top. But this, he tapped the paper, is what created the crisis. Ethan stared at it as though hoping no one else would notice. I looked down. The heading read, Business Line of Credit, Outstanding Balance, $286, 417. I blinked several times. Surely I had misread it. Ethan. My voice barely came out. What is this? He remained silent. Lauren leaned over the table. As she read the number, every bit of color disappeared from her face. She looked at Ethan in complete disbelief. You told me the business loan was paid off. It almost was. No. She shook her head. You said there was less than 20,000 left. He whispered. I couldn't tell you. You couldn't tell me. Her voice rose. We've been arguing over grocery bills while you were hiding almost $300,000. Richard and Pastor David exchanged worried glances. Michael remained composed. This wasn't ordinary consumer debt. It appears Ethan personally guaranteed several loans for a consulting business that ultimately failed. I stared at my son. You never told me you started another business. I didn't want anyone worrying. I almost laughed through my tears. Instead of preventing worry, he had nearly destroyed our family. Lauren slowly sat down. She looked utterly exhausted. I thought this was about my credit cards. She laughed bitterly. I actually believed I was the financial problem. Ethan covered his face with both hands. You were never the problem. No, she replied quietly. You were. For the first time since this nightmare began, I no longer saw a man driven by greed alone. I saw a frightened son who had buried one terrible decision beneath another until he no longer knew how to climb back out. But understanding someone's fear is not the same as excusing what they did because of it. I looked around the dining room. Thomas's letter still rested beside my hand. His handwriting seemed almost alive beneath the bright dining room light. One sentence returned to my mind. Good people make terrible decisions when they convince themselves those decisions are temporary. Thomas had been right. Ethan hadn't become a monster overnight. He had become a desperate man who kept choosing the easier lie instead of the harder truth. And now, every lie had finally run out of places to hide. No one rushed to fill the silence after the truth about Ethan's debt came out. The room had reached a place where shouting no longer seemed necessary. There was nothing left to expose, only consequences remained. Ethan sat heavily in one of the dining room chairs and buried his face in his hands. He looked older than his 40 years. The confident financial consultant, who had once believed he could solve any problem, had disappeared. In his place sat a tired man who had spent months carrying lies that had finally become too heavy to lift. I watched him quietly. Part of me wanted answers. Another part of me wasn't sure I wanted to hear them. Pastor David gently pulled out another chair and sat across from Ethan. He didn't lecture him. He didn't quote scripture. He simply asked one question. When did this really begin? For several seconds, Ethan didn't answer. Finally, he lowered his hands. About 3 years ago. Michael remained silent. Richard folded his arms. Everyone waited. My company downsized after the pandemic, Ethan began. I found another consulting job pretty quickly, but it paid less. I remembered that period. He had told us everything was fine. Apparently it wasn't. I didn't want Mom worrying, he continued. She had already lost Dad. So I said nothing. That part, I understood. Every parent knows what it feels like to hide your own fears to protect someone you love. But the story didn't end there. A former coworker approached me with a business opportunity. Michael quietly nodded. The consulting firm. Ethan nodded. He said companies were desperate for financial restructuring advice. It sounded solid. At first, it was. He leaned back and stared at the ceiling. We actually made money during the first year. Lauren looked at him in surprise. You told me the business was always struggling. It wasn't. His voice cracked. It became struggling. He rubbed his forehead. We expanded too quickly. We hired people, leased office space, signed long-term contracts. When clients started canceling, he shook his head. Everything collapsed. Michael glanced at the financial statements, the personal guarantees. Ethan nodded again. I signed them. Lauren stared at him. You never told me that. I couldn't. You should have. I know. She looked away. I would have stood beside you. His answer came almost immediately. I didn't deserve that. No one interrupted. Sometimes people tell the truth only after they finally stop defending themselves. I kept believing one more contract would fix everything. One more client. One more month. His breathing became uneven. When that didn't happen, I borrowed more. Refinanced our cars. Used credit cards. Moved balances. Took out another loan. Each sentence sounded like another stone being dropped into deep water. I told myself it was temporary. Thomas's letter echoed in my mind once again. Good people make terrible decisions when they convince themselves those decisions are temporary. Ethan continued. Then Lauren started asking questions. Lauren nodded slowly. I knew we had credit card debt. I knew business had slowed. I never knew it was anywhere close to this. She looked genuinely devastated. I kept asking why we weren't saving anything. Ethan closed his eyes. I kept lying. Michael asked quietly, when did you first think about using Chloe's house? The question seemed almost impossible for Ethan to answer. He stared at the table for nearly a full minute. Finally, the day the bank rejected my third application. I felt something inside me tighten. Why my house? He looked directly at me for the first time that evening. Because. His eyes filled with tears. It was the only thing valuable enough. The words struck harder than I expected. Not because he had called the house valuable, because he had reduced 38 years of memories to a financial solution. I wasn't trying to steal it. He said the sentence almost desperately. I convinced myself you would eventually agree. You loved us. You loved the kids. You always put everyone else first. His voice broke completely. I kept telling myself that once everything stabilized, I'd fix it. I'd tell you. I'd apologize. I'd make everything right. Michael spoke quietly. And if she refused? Ethan didn't answer. Michael repeated the question. If Chloe had refused? A long silence followed. Finally, Ethan whispered, I stopped asking myself that. Those words hurt more than everything else, because they were honest. At some point, he had simply decided my opinion no longer mattered. Lauren suddenly stood. She walked several steps away from the table before turning back. I need you to answer something. Ethan looked at her. When were you planning to tell me the truth? He looked down again. I don't know. No. She shook her head. You do know. You just don't like the answer. He remained silent. She laughed bitterly. I spent months believing we were making difficult family decisions together. I defended you. I defended us. She pointed toward me. I even convinced myself Chloe would eventually understand. Her voice softened. But you never trusted me with the truth. He whispered. I was ashamed. So instead, you made me part of a lie. She slowly sat back down. Tears rolled silently down her cheeks. I can forgive mistakes. I don't know if I can forgive being used. The room became quiet again. Richard finally spoke. I've interviewed hundreds of people over my career. Everyone looked toward him. The guilty ones usually spend all their energy explaining why they shouldn't be blamed. He looked at Ethan. You haven't done that tonight. Ethan shook his head. Because I am to blame. Richard nodded. That's the first honest thing you've said that can actually help you. Pastor David leaned forward. Confession isn't the same thing as change. No, Ethan replied. It isn't. But it's where change starts. I listened carefully. Part of me wanted to believe him. Another part remembered the packed suitcase, the changed locks, the empty bedroom, the contractors, the moving truck, the photographs missing from the walls. One confession couldn't erase months of deliberate choices. I finally spoke. Ethan. He immediately looked at me. I need you to answer one final question. Anything. When you looked at me tonight, I paused, struggling to steady my voice. When you told me I was sleeping somewhere else, were you thinking about me? Or were you only thinking about your debt? He closed his eyes. When he answered, his voice barely rose above a whisper. I was thinking about surviving. The honesty of that answer somehow hurt less than another lie would have, because survival had become so important to him that he had forgotten someone else's survival entirely. Mine. I slowly nodded. I appreciate your honesty. He looked hopeful for just a moment. Then I continued. But honesty doesn't erase what happened. His shoulders dropped. I know. You packed my life into boxes. I know. You changed the locks. I know. You were willing to watch me believe I no longer had a home. He covered his face again. I'm so sorry. I believed he meant those words. For the first time that evening, I truly believed them. But another truth had become equally clear. Regret is not the same thing as restoration. An apology is not the same thing as accountability. And love, real love, requires much more than simply wishing you could undo the damage after it's already been done. As I looked around the dining room one more time, I realized that the hardest part of this night was no longer discovering what Ethan had done. It was deciding what justice looked like when the person who betrayed you was the little boy you had once rocked to sleep every night. The Hendersons offered their guest room. One of my former students, now a firefighter, handed me his phone number and said, "Day or night, Mrs. Murray." I thanked each of them, but what stayed with me wasn't what they said. It was that they had come. People make time for what matters to them. That night, my neighbors reminded me that I still mattered. When the front door finally closed behind the last visitor, only 7 people remained inside the house. Me, Ethan, Lauren, Michael, Richard, Pastor David, Helen. No one seemed eager to leave. Not because there was more evidence to examine, because the hardest part still lay ahead. Michael carefully gathered the legal documents and placed them back into his leather case. The ownership issue is settled, he said calmly. Chloe remains the sole legal owner of this property. Richard nodded. And no one has the right to remove her from this house. There was relief in hearing those words spoken aloud. Yet I also understood something else. Winning legally did not mean my family had been repaired. In many ways, the real work hadn't even begun. Lauren broke the silence first. I want to know something. She looked directly at Ethan. No lies. No excuses. He nodded. I'll answer. She took a slow breath. When were you planning to tell the children? His face immediately tightened. I wasn't. She blinked. What? I wasn't going to. So Noah and Emma would have come home from school, and Grandma would simply be gone. He couldn't answer. Lauren's eyes filled with tears. They adore her. I know. They would have thought she chose to leave. I know. You were willing to let your own children believe that. He lowered his head. I thought it would be easier. For whom? She asked quietly. He didn't answer. Because there was no answer. The truth was obvious. Easier for him, not for anyone else. Pastor David leaned back in his chair. I've counseled families for more than 30 years. He folded his hands. Do you know the most common lie people tell themselves? No one spoke. They say, I'm hurting the people I love today so they'll thank me tomorrow. He looked toward Ethan. It almost never works. Ethan nodded silently. I know. No, Pastor David replied gently. Tonight you finally understand. Knowing comes afterward. His words settled deeply into the room. Michael stood. I think everyone needs a little air. He looked at me. Would you like to step outside for a few minutes? I nodded. The cool October night felt completely different now. The floodlights had been turned off, leaving only the porch light glowing warmly above the front door. The neighborhood had become quiet again. Richard stood beside the maple tree Thomas and I planted when Ethan started kindergarten. He smiled sadly. I remember helping Thomas dig that hole. So do I. He insisted it wasn't deep enough. I laughed softly despite everything. Because he measured it 3 times. Richard chuckled. He measured everything 3 times. We stood together in silence. Finally, I asked the question that had been growing inside me all evening. Richard, when did you first become worried about me? He thought for a moment. Honestly, yes. The day you apologized for entering your own garage. I frowned. I did, he nodded. I was walking my dog. You pulled into the driveway. Ethan and a contractor were inside the garage. When you walked in, you said, I'm sorry, am I interrupting something? He looked directly at me. That sentence bothered me. Why, you built this house. You've lived here for decades. No homeowner should apologize for entering her own garage. His words struck me harder than I expected. I remembered that day. I had apologized instinctively, without even realizing it. Richard continued. Control rarely begins with shouting. It begins when someone slowly convinces another person that asking permission feels normal. I stared at the front porch. Had that really happened? Had I gradually accepted becoming a guest inside my own life? The answer hurt, because it was yes. When we returned inside, I found Helen sitting beside Lauren in the living room. Lauren had been crying. She quickly wiped her eyes. I owe you an apology. She looked directly at me. I know. No. She shook her head. You don't know. I let myself believe that because Ethan loved you, everything he suggested had to be for your own good. She swallowed hard. When I questioned him, he always had an answer. He said you were lonely. He said you wanted less responsibility. He said you'd mentioned moving after Thomas passed. I quietly replied, I never said that. I know, her voice cracked. I know that now. She looked around the room. I should have asked you. Instead, I accepted someone else's version of your life. That sentence stayed with me. accepted someone else's version of your life. How often does that happen? People speak for us, decide for us, interpret our feelings, until eventually, even we begin doubting our own voice. Lauren took a deep breath. I was wrong. I wasn't honest. I wasn't brave. I chose comfort over truth. She looked down. And because of that, I helped hurt you. For several seconds, I simply watched her. Months earlier, I probably would have rushed to comfort her. That was who I had always been. But something inside me had changed. Compassion did not require pretending the damage never happened. I appreciate your apology. She looked hopeful. Then I continued. But forgiveness and trust are different things. She nodded slowly. I understand. I hope one day. She stopped herself. No. She corrected her own sentence. I hope one day I earn the chance to ask for forgiveness. That was different. And perhaps wiser. Just then the front door opened. Everyone turned. Noah stood in the doorway. Behind him was Lauren's sister Melissa. Emma rushed in immediately after him. Grandma! Before anyone could stop her, Emma ran across the room and threw her arms around me. I hugged her tightly. Noah looked around the room confused by the serious faces. What happened? No one answered immediately. He looked at Ethan. Dad? Ethan couldn't speak. Instead, Noah looked at me. His eyes slowly filled with tears. I'm sorry. I frowned. For what? He reached into the pocket of his hoodie and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I tried. What do you mean? He handed it to me. It was a handwritten note. My name was written across the front, Grandma. I carefully unfolded it. The note was short, only 3 sentences. Grandma, I think Mom and Dad are going to make you leave. I don't know when. Please don't be mad at them. I just wanted you to know I love you. My vision blurred. Noah. He looked down. I wanted to leave it in your room. Dad came home early. I got scared. So I kept it. Tears rolled down his face. I didn't know how to warn you. I pulled him into my arms beside Emma. Neither child understood mortgages, property law, business debt, or refinancing. They only understood that the people they loved were hurting. And somehow, the youngest person in the room had shown more courage than many of the adults. Holding my grandchildren close, I silently made one promise. Whatever happened next, they would never again be forced to carry the weight of choices that belong to grown-ups. Because while trust between adults can be broken and slowly rebuilt, the hearts of children deserve to be protected first. The first sunrise after the longest night of my life arrived quietly. Soft golden light spilled across the kitchen floor, illuminating the same oak table where Thomas and I had shared thousands of breakfasts over nearly 4 decades. So much had changed in a single evening, yet the morning sun still found its way through the same windows. There was something comforting about that. Some things in life continue faithfully even when everything else seems uncertain. I woke after barely 2 hours of sleep. Not because I couldn't close my eyes. Because every time I did, I saw my packed suitcase standing beside the front door. I heard Ethan's voice again. You're sleeping somewhere else tonight. Some sentences never completely leave you. When I walked downstairs, Michael was already sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee. He smiled gently. Good morning. I don't think either of us slept. He chuckled softly. No, I've been thinking. So have I. The house felt strangely empty. Richard had gone home shortly before dawn. Pastor David left after making sure everyone had calmed down. Helen promised to return later that morning. Lauren and the children had spent the remainder of the night at her sister Melissa's house. Ethan had slept on the living room couch, not because anyone forced him, because he said he didn't deserve a bedroom. I wasn't sure how I felt about that. Michael motioned toward the chair across from him. We need to discuss what happens next. I sat down slowly. What are my options? He answered immediately. Legally, yes. You have several. He opened his notebook. First, you could ask Ethan and Lauren to leave immediately. I quietly nodded. Second, you could give them a written deadline to move out. Third, You could allow them to stay temporarily under clearly defined legal agreements. He paused. But regardless of which option you choose, he looked directly into my eyes. One thing cannot happen. What? You cannot return to the arrangement that existed yesterday. I already knew he was right. The old normal no longer existed. Even if I wanted to pretend nothing had happened, I couldn't. Michael continued. For months, decisions were made without your knowledge. That ends today. Your financial accounts need to be secured. Passwords changed. Mail redirected. Banking restored to your control. I listened carefully. It struck me that every recommendation he made wasn't about punishment. It was about restoring something that had quietly been taken from me. My independence. While we talked, I heard footsteps behind us. Ethan entered the kitchen. He looked exhausted. His shirt was wrinkled. His eyes were red. He hesitated before speaking. Can we talk? Michael looked toward me. I'll give you both some privacy. As he stood, I gently stopped him. No. I looked at Ethan. Nothing about our family should happen in secret anymore. He nodded. You're right. Michael quietly sat back down. Ethan remained standing. I've been thinking all night. So have I. He swallowed. I'm moving out. I waited. You don't have to ask. I'm leaving. I studied his face carefully. There wasn't any bitterness, only exhaustion. I've already called a friend. I can stay with him. I'll collect only my personal things. He paused. Everything else stays. I finally spoke. Why? He looked confused. Why what? Why now? His answer came without hesitation. Because every time I look around this house, I remember Dad. He looked toward the hallway. I remember him teaching me how to ride my bike. I remember Christmas mornings. I remember building birdhouses in the garage. His voice broke. And then, I remember what I almost destroyed. Silence settled between us. I can't stay here pretending none of that happened. I appreciated his honesty. But honesty alone wasn't enough. Ethan. Yes. I need you to understand something. He nodded. I am not asking you to leave because I hate you. His eyes immediately filled with tears. I'm asking you to leave because I need to feel safe in my own home again. He lowered his head. I understand. I don't know if you do. He looked back up. I continued quietly. For months, I questioned my own memory, my own judgment, my own place inside this family. I apologized for entering my own garage. I stopped opening my own mail. I accepted being excluded from conversations about my own life. I paused. I don't know how long it will take me to trust myself again. He whispered, I'm sorry. I know. And I believe you. His eyes widened slightly. You do. Yes. I believe you're sorry. But regret doesn't erase consequences. He nodded slowly. I know. A few minutes later, Lauren arrived. Melissa drove her back so the children wouldn't witness another difficult conversation. She looked calmer than she had the night before. I heard Ethan's decision. She looked toward him. I think it's the right one. He nodded silently. Lauren turned to me. I'm leaving too. She took a deep breath. I've already spoken with Melissa. The kids and I can stay there for a while. I looked at her carefully. What about school? We'll figure it out. What about Ethan? She closed her eyes briefly. I honestly don't know. There was no anger in her voice anymore, only sadness. The children need stability. They don't need arguments. I nodded. For once, we agree. She gave a weak smile. I suppose we finally do. Late that morning, Noah and Emma came inside carrying small backpacks. Neither child understood everything that had happened. But children understand enough. Emma wrapped her arms around my waist. Grandma, are you coming with us? I knelt beside her. No, sweetheart. This is my home. She smiled with obvious relief. Good. I didn't want your flowers to be lonely. Even after everything, a 10-year-old had found the simplest truth. Home wasn't just where people lived, it was where someone cared enough to worry about flowers. Noah approached more cautiously. He looked at Ethan, then at me. Is Dad leaving? Ethan answered himself. Yes. For a while. Noah nodded. He didn't cry. Instead, he walked over and hugged his father tightly. I'm still going to love you. Ethan immediately began crying. I know. Noah looked at me next. And I'm still going to love Grandma. I smiled through my tears. I know that too. He looked from one of us to the other. So, you don't have to make me choose. My heart broke. No, I answered firmly. You will never have to choose. I looked directly at Ethan. Our disagreements belong to us. They do not belong to Noah. Or Emma. He nodded immediately. They never will. By early afternoon, Ethan packed several suitcases. Not mine. His. As he carried the final box toward his truck, he stopped beside the maple tree Thomas had planted decades earlier. He rested one hand against its rough bark. Then he quietly whispered something I couldn't hear. Perhaps he was speaking to his father. Perhaps to himself. Perhaps both. Before getting into the truck, he walked back toward the porch. I know I haven't earned forgiveness. He looked at me steadily. So I'm not asking for it. I'll spend whatever time it takes becoming someone Dad would recognize again. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I answered with the only words that felt honest. I hope you do. He nodded once. Then he drove away. I watched his truck disappear around the corner until I could no longer see it. For the first time in months, the house felt quiet. Not because it was empty, because it finally belonged to truth again. And although forgiveness remained somewhere far down a road neither of us could yet see, the first step toward healing had finally begun. It wasn't built on promises, it was built on accountability. Exactly where Thomas would have wanted it to begin. People often imagine healing as a single moment, a hug, an apology, a decision to forgive. Life, however, has taught me something very different. Healing is usually quiet. It sounds like a hammer tapping a loose nail back into place. It looks like fresh paint covering old scars. It feels like making your bed one morning and realizing you no longer expect someone else to tell you where you belong. The weeks after Ethan and Lauren moved out were among the busiest I had experienced in years. Not because I wanted to erase the past, because I wanted to reclaim my home. Michael insisted we begin with practical matters. Within 2 days, every bank account password had been changed. My mail was redirected exclusively to me. New locks were installed not to keep my family out, but to remind myself that I had the right to feel secure. Richard stood beside the locksmith the entire afternoon. When the last lock clicked into place, he handed me the new key. This one, he said with a smile, belongs exactly where it always should have. He placed it in my hand. Simple, ordinary, yet somehow it felt like receiving my life back. Inside the house, every room seemed to carry traces of what had happened. Not because furniture had been damaged, because memories had. The dining room walls still displayed pale rectangles where family photographs had once hung. I stood there for a long time one Saturday morning holding a box Michael had recovered from the storage unit Ethan rented. Inside were dozens of framed photographs. Our wedding, Thomas holding Ethan as a baby, Noah catching his first fish, Emma wearing butterfly wings during a school play. Every frame had been wrapped carefully. Even in the middle of all his terrible decisions, Ethan hadn't thrown them away. That realization mattered to me. It didn't excuse him. But it reminded me there was still something human beneath the fear that had consumed him. Helen arrived carrying homemade cinnamon rolls. She looked at the empty wall and smiled gently. Let's put your family back where they belong. For the next 3 hours, the two of us measured, laughed, argued over crooked frames, and finally stepped back to admire the finished wall. It looks like home again, Helen whispered. I nodded. It feels closer. Not complete. Closer. A few days later, Richard knocked on my door carrying a toolbox. I brought reinforcements. For what? You've been talking about turning Thomas's workshop into something special. I smiled. I have. For years after Thomas passed away, I had barely entered the workshop. The smell of cedar and machine oil always made me cry. Now, it made me remember. There is a difference. Richard opened the garage doors, letting autumn sunlight pour across the workbench. Dust floated lazily through the air. Everything remained exactly where Thomas had left it. His old measuring tape still hung beside the drill press. His favorite carpenter's pencil rested inside a coffee mug. His worn leather work gloves lay folded on the bench. Richard picked up one glove. He'd yell at me if I moved this. I laughed. He absolutely would. Together we spent the day cleaning. Not changing. Cleaning. Every shelf. Every cabinet. Every tool. As afternoon faded into evening, I stood quietly in the doorway. I don't want to turn this into a museum, I said. Richard nodded. What do you want? I looked around the room. I want children to learn here. His eyes brightened. Thomas would like that. So would I. Within 2 weeks, an idea that had lived quietly inside my heart began taking shape. With help from Pastor David, the church announced free Saturday woodworking classes for neighborhood children. Retired volunteers offered to teach. Parents immediately signed up. On the very first Saturday morning, 12 children filled Thomas's workshop with laughter. Tiny hammers, crooked birdhouses, sawdust everywhere. Exactly the kind of joyful chaos Thomas had always loved. One little boy accidentally bent 3 nails before driving one in correctly. He looked embarrassed. I smiled. Your grandfather would have done exactly the same thing. The workshop no longer felt like a room frozen in grief. It had become a room filled with possibility. Inside the house, another project slowly came together. The spare bedroom that Ethan once planned to convert into his office became something entirely different. A neighborhood reading room. The books I had repaired at the library lined the shelves. Thomas's favorite leather reading chair sat beside the window. Children from church began stopping by after school to borrow books. Emma loved helping organize the shelves whenever she visited. She proudly created handwritten category labels: adventure, history, animals, mysteries. One sign she made still hangs above the doorway today. Stories help hearts grow. I never corrected her grammar. Some things are already perfect. Noah began visiting every other Saturday. At first he arrived quietly, almost cautiously, as though afraid he no longer belonged. One afternoon, while we sanded birdhouses together, he finally asked the question I knew had been weighing on him. Grandma. Yes. Are you still mad at Dad? I set down the sandpaper. What do you think? He shrugged. I think you miss him. Children often see truths adults complicate. I do. He looked relieved. So, you can miss someone and still be hurt. I smiled sadly. Very much. He thought about that. I miss him too. I know. But, he hesitated. I'm also angry. I wrapped one arm gently around his shoulders. Both feelings can exist together. You don't have to choose only one. He nodded quietly. I wish adults understood that. I laughed softly. So do I. Life gradually found a new rhythm. I returned to volunteering at the library 3 days each week. Church became something I looked forward to again, instead of a place where I pretended everything was fine. Neighbors stopped by more often than before. Not because they pitied me, because the walls that once kept everyone politely distant had somehow disappeared. One chilly November evening, Helen arrived carrying a pumpkin pie. Richard brought coffee. Pastor David stopped in after visiting another church member. Someone suggested we eat together. Then someone else invited the Hendersons. Within an hour, my dining room held 10 people. Nobody had planned it. Nobody had organized it. It simply happened. As I looked around the table, I suddenly remembered the night Ethan had packed my suitcase. The same room, the same table, the same walls. Yet everything felt completely different. Because fear had been replaced by honesty. Laughter had replaced silence. Community had replaced isolation. Later that evening, after everyone left, I stood alone on the front porch. The maple tree Thomas planted had already shed most of its leaves. The branches looked bare against the autumn sky. But I knew something the tree didn't need to prove. Winter never means life has ended. Sometimes it simply means roots are growing stronger, where no one can see them. I smiled toward the quiet street. For the first time in many months, I wasn't wondering whether I would lose my home. I was thinking about all the new memories still waiting to be made inside it, and somehow, that felt like the greatest gift Thomas could have left me. Winter arrived gently that year. The first snowfall covered the neighborhood in a thin blanket of white, softening rooftops, sidewalks, and even the painful memories attached to my front yard. Looking out the kitchen window one December morning, I watched snowflakes settle on the maple tree Thomas had planted more than 30 years earlier. It stood bare, patient, quiet. Trees have a remarkable way of teaching us that life doesn't stop simply because a season changes. I was beginning to learn the same lesson. Nearly 4 months had passed since the night Ethan tried to send me away. Life no longer felt like it had been shattered. It felt rearranged. Some relationships had become stronger. Some had become more honest. Some had become more distant. All of them had changed. Every Saturday, the workshop filled with neighborhood children, building birdhouses, toy boxes, and simple shelves under the guidance of retired volunteers. Every Tuesday afternoon, the reading room welcomed children after school. Every Sunday church felt less like an obligation and more like coming home. For the first time since Thomas died, I had stopped surviving. I had started living again. Then one cold Friday evening just before Christmas, there was a knock at my front door. Not hurried, not uncertain, just 3 quiet knocks. When I opened the door, Ethan stood on the porch, alone. Snow covered the shoulders of his dark coat. His beard had grown slightly longer than usual. He looked thinner, healthier strangely enough. Not because life had become easier, because it appeared he had finally stopped running from it. He held nothing in his hands, no flowers, no gifts, no carefully rehearsed speech written on folded paper. Just himself. "I know I should have called first," he said quietly. "I'll leave if you want." For a moment, I simply looked at him. Months earlier, seeing him had immediately reminded me of betrayal. Now, it reminded me of sadness. There is a difference. "You drove all this way." He nodded. "You might as well come inside." He hesitated. "Only if you're sure." "I'm sure." He stepped inside and carefully wiped the snow from his boots before entering the living room. That tiny gesture almost made me smile. Thomas had always insisted nobody tracked snow across freshly cleaned floors. Some habits survive even difficult seasons. I made coffee. He waited silently at the kitchen table until I joined him. Neither of us rushed to speak. Finally, I broke the silence. "How are you?" He smiled faintly. I think that's the first time anyone has asked me that without expecting something in return. "So," he took a deep breath. "I'm working." I heard. He looked surprised. "You did?" Pastor David had mentioned several weeks earlier that Ethan had accepted a position with a nonprofit organization helping small businesses recover from financial hardship. I nodded. "He told me." Ethan looked down at his coffee. "It's different. In a good way. Very. I make less money. But," he smiled for the first time, "I sleep." That simple sentence said more than any financial report ever could. I sold my truck. I moved into a small apartment. I've been meeting with a financial counselor every week. I've repaid 2 of the personal loans. He reached into his coat pocket. "I wanted you to see something." He handed me several folded documents, loan statements, each one stamped paid in full. I looked at him. "You didn't have to show me." "I know. I'm not trying to impress you." He paused. "I'm trying to be transparent." That word mattered. For months, secrecy had poisoned our family. Transparency felt like fresh air entering a room that had been closed too long. "I also wanted to tell you something else." I waited. "I've been seeing a counselor." I raised my eyebrows. "Personally?" He nodded. I finally admitted I couldn't fix everything by myself. How has that been? He smiled sadly. Uncomfortable. But honest. He looked around the kitchen. I've spent most of my life believing my value came from solving problems. When I failed, I thought admitting it would make me worthless. He shook his head. My counselor keeps reminding me that hiding failure creates much bigger failures. I thought of Thomas again. He would have liked that sentence. After a few moments, Ethan looked directly at me. I owe you something. You already apologized. I know. This isn't another apology. He reached into his jacket and removed a small envelope. What is it? I made a list. I opened it. Inside was a handwritten page. Across the top he had written, "Things I took that weren't mine." I frowned. Then I began reading. Your trust, your peace, your confidence, your independence, your voice, your sense of safety, your memories, your right to decide. At the bottom, he had added one final sentence. Some of these things can't be returned. I know that. But I will spend the rest of my life trying to become someone who never takes them from anyone again. By the time I finished reading, tears blurred the page. Not because the letter erased the past, because it acknowledged it honestly. I wrote that after my counselor asked me a question. What question? What exactly did you steal? I started talking about the house. He shook his head. She stopped me. The house wasn't yours to steal. Think harder. He looked at me. That's when I realized I stole things no bank could ever value. We sat quietly for several minutes. Finally, I asked, "What about Lauren?" He smiled sadly. "We're separated." I know. We're trying to be respectful. The kids come first. Good. We're both working with counselors. I hope. He stopped. No. He corrected himself. I don't know what our future looks like, but I know what kind of father I want to become. Outside, snow continued falling gently across the yard. The silence between us no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt peaceful. Eventually, Ethan stood. I should go. As we walked toward this front door, he stopped beside the family photographs hanging in the hallway. He looked at one picture for a long time. Thomas standing beside the maple tree on the day we planted it. I used to think Dad would be ashamed of me. He spoke almost in a whisper. What do you think now? He looked at the photograph. I think he'd be disappointed. He swallowed. But I also think he'd expect me to become better instead of hiding forever. I nodded slowly. That sounds like your father. He smiled. Before opening the door, he turned back toward me. I don't expect forgiveness. I know. I don't expect things to go back to normal. They can't. He nodded. I only hope, he paused again, that one day when you think about me, you'll remember more than the worst thing I've ever done. I walked closer until we stood only a few feet apart. Ethan, he looked at me. The worst thing you've ever done does not have to become the only thing you ever are. His eyes filled with tears. But whether that happens, I gently placed one hand on his shoulder. Depends entirely on the choices you make from this day forward. He nodded. I understand. For the first time since that terrible October night, I hugged my son. It wasn't a hug that erased betrayal. It wasn't a hug that restored trust. It was something much smaller, and perhaps much more important. It was the beginning of hope. As he walked toward his truck through the falling snow, I stood quietly on the porch, watching. Not because I feared he might come back and hurt me again, but because for the first time in many months, I truly believed he was walking toward a different life, one built not on hidden debts or desperate lies, but on the slow, difficult work of becoming the man Thomas had always believed he could be. A full year has passed since the night my son looked at me and quietly said, "You're sleeping somewhere else tonight." For a long time I believed those words would forever define my story. I was wrong. Pain may begin a story. It does not have to write the ending. The seasons turned exactly as they always had. Winter surrendered to spring. Spring welcomed summer. Summer slowly faded into another beautiful Ohio autumn. The maple tree, Thomas planted outside our front porch, grew another ring beneath its bark. And somehow, so did I. People often ask whether life ever returned to normal. The honest answer is no. Normal belonged to another lifetime. What came afterward wasn't normal, it was healthier. Healthier because secrets no longer lived inside our family. Healthier because boundaries finally existed. Healthier because every relationship had been rebuilt on truth instead of assumptions. My reading room became one of my favorite places in the house. Every Tuesday afternoon, neighborhood children filled the shelves with backpacks, laughter, and endless questions about books. Emma still insisted on organizing every returned novel before she left. She had even started recommending books to younger children. Watching her carefully place a story into another child's hands reminded me so much of Thomas that sometimes I had to quietly wipe away tears before anyone noticed. The woodworking workshop continued growing beyond anything I had imagined. Richard joked that Thomas would probably complain about how disorganized everyone's toolboxes were. The children laughed every time he said it. Noah eventually became one of the volunteer helpers. He wasn't the smallest child anymore. At 14, he patiently taught younger kids how to sand rough edges before painting birdhouses. One Saturday morning, I watched him gently correct a little boy who had accidentally split a piece of wood. "It's okay," Noah smiled. "My grandpa always said mistakes become part of the project." I froze. Thomas had said those exact words. Some lessons survive because they're spoken. Others survive because they're lived. Noah had carried his grandfather forward without even realizing it. As for Lauren, life led her down a different path. She and Ethan finalized an amicable divorce several months after separating. It wasn't dramatic. There were no courtroom battles, no public accusations, just two people finally admitting they could no longer build a healthy marriage on a foundation that had already collapsed. To her credit, Lauren never once tried to keep the children away from me. In fact, she encouraged their visits. One afternoon, while dropping Emma off for the weekend, she remained on the porch after the children ran inside. "I owe you something," she said. "You've already apologized." "I know," she smiled faintly. "But I wanted you to know something." "What?" "I started volunteering at a women's financial literacy program." I looked at her with quiet surprise. "They help women understand budgeting, debt, and financial independence." She laughed softly. "I suppose I finally realized how dangerous it is when people stop asking questions." I nodded. "I think that's a beautiful lesson." "So do I." She looked toward the children laughing inside the house. "I can't change what happened, but maybe I can keep someone else from repeating it." For the first time, I saw peace in her eyes. Not perfection. Peace. Then there was Ethan. We never returned to what we once had. Some bridges once burned can be crossed again, but they never look the same. Every Sunday afternoon he visited for dinner, always after calling first, always asking, never assuming. The first few months felt awkward. Conversation remained polite, careful, measured. Trust grows more slowly than suspicion, but it does grow. One evening after dinner, Noah challenged Ethan and me to a game of checkers. As I watched my son intentionally lose because Emma wanted to win, I saw something I hadn't seen in years. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. I wasn't trying to fix anything. He was simply being present. Sometimes redemption isn't found in grand gestures. Sometimes it's found in ordinary consistency. He continued attending counseling, continued paying off debt, continued living modestly, never once asking me for money, never once mentioning the house. Not because he forgot what happened, because he refused to repeat it. One afternoon, nearly a year after everything changed, Michael Reynolds stopped by carrying a small envelope. "I found this while organizing old files." He handed it to me. Inside was another note from Thomas, only a few lines long. Apparently he had written it years before while updating our estate plan. It simply said, "Homes can be inherited, character cannot. If our family ever faces hardship, I hope they choose honesty before comfort." I folded the note carefully and placed it beside the others. Thomas never imagined exactly how our family would be tested, but somehow, he still managed to leave us the wisdom we needed. Then came the evening that reminded me how far we had traveled. It was the anniversary of Thomas's birthday. The whole family gathered at my house. Lauren came with the children. Ethan arrived carrying a homemade apple pie. Richard and Helen joined us. Pastor David stopped by after evening service. The dining room overflowed with laughter once again, not because the past had disappeared, because we had stopped pretending it never happened. After dinner, Emma asked if we could all take a family photograph outside. By Grandpa's tree, she insisted. Everyone agreed. We walked onto the front lawn together. The sun had already disappeared below the horizon. As Noah adjusted the camera tripod, Emma suddenly shouted, "Grandma, turn the lights on." I looked toward the porch. For just a second, I hesitated. Exactly 1 year earlier, those same exterior floodlights had illuminated the worst moment of my life. The memory still lived somewhere inside me. Then Ethan quietly stepped beside me. "You don't have to." I looked at him. "No." I smiled gently. "I think I do." I reached inside the front door and flipped the familiar switch. One by one, the floodlights came alive. Warm golden light spread across the yard, across the maple tree, across the flower beds, across the smiling faces of children chasing one another across the grass, across neighbors carrying extra folding chairs because someone always forgot enough seats, across friends who had once stood in this very yard ready to defend me. The lights hadn't changed, their meaning had. A year ago, they exposed betrayal. Tonight, they welcomed family home. Emma grabbed my hand. "Grandma, hurry, we're waiting." I walked toward everyone gathering beneath the maple tree. Noah adjusted the camera timer. Richard complained that he always blinked in photographs. Helen laughed. Pastor David wrapped one arm around Michael's shoulder. Ethan stood quietly near the back, uncertain where he belonged. I reached for his hand. "Come stand with us." His eyes widened. "Are you sure?" I nodded. "We're taking a picture, not rewriting history." "There's a difference." He smiled through tears. "I understand." The camera beeped. 5 seconds. 4, 3. Emma squeezed my hand. 2, 1. The shutter clicked. And in that single frozen moment, I finally understood something that had taken me an entire year to learn. A house can be threatened. A family can be broken. Trust can be shattered. But dignity, once reclaimed, becomes the strongest foundation of all. If someone ever tells you that love requires surrendering your voice, your peace, or your self-respect, please don't believe them. Love without honesty becomes control. Forgiveness without accountability becomes permission. But when truth, responsibility, and compassion finally stand together, even the darkest night